Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're in round 3 of the 2015 Norway chess tournament. We're going to be featuring Nakamura playing the white pieces, facing off against Fabiano Caruana playing the black pieces. These are two of the top 4 players in the world. Nakamura currently ranked number 4, and Fabiano playing the black pieces currently ranked number 2. Nakamura's just been on tear. He's essentially won every tournament he's played. He qualified for the Candidates tournament in the Grand Prix, so he'll be playing next year with an opportunity, if he wins that, to go on and face Magnus Carlsen for the championship, which would be extremely exciting, especially being an American. It's been a while since an American was at kind of that top level or can kind of challenge for the world championship. So I think that would be exciting, especially for the press around the States. But today we have an exciting match against Nakamura and Caruana, so we'll go ahead and get into it. Nakamura starts out with knight 2 f3, knight f6, pawn c4, pawn c5. So we're getting into not only the English opening, but we're also getting into the symmetrical English defense, which we don't see all that often, but always good to see new openings, especially at high-level play that aren't super common. Knight c3, knight c6, pawn here to g3, and then pawn to d5. Fabiano decides he wants to go ahead and break things up right now. He could, if he wanted to, continue to just play pawn here to g6. If we see fianchetto here, we could continue to see fianchetto here to g7. But instead decides, okay, I want to go ahead and break things up a little bit, and starts with pawn to d5. We see capture here on d5, recapture, and then bishop here to g2, fianchetto. Pawn here to g6, so now getting ready to fianchetto his own bishop here to g7. We see castle on the king side, and then fianchetto here to g7. Now knight's going to take here on d5, and now the queen comes out. Pawn here to d3. These are all kind of the main lines, so not too much new stuff going on here. This is all pretty theoretical. Castle on the king side, bishop here to e3. Now this is a place where white has a few options. His bishop is protecting this pawn here on b2, so he could make an argument to keep his bishop here on c1. One of the options you get after you play pawn here to d3 is you can now play your knight up here to g5, since it is protected by a bishop right here on c1, and this allows you to be somewhat aggressive on the king side of black. Nakamura decides to go against that, plays bishop here to e3. I really like bishop here to f4. I think it's maybe a little bit more aggressive, but he prepared the line bishop here to e3, and that's completely fine as well. Fabiano plays bishop here to d7. Another line, just so many different options in this, but bishop to b2 seems pretty interesting to me. Now, the rook's going to come here to b1, and then we could see just the bishop come back here to g7. That seems like an option. Now, queen to a4, just some of the possible moves you could see. Queen back here to d6, knowing that there could be a discovered attack if this knight moves here, opening up the door for this light square bishop. Knight here to g5 possibly. All this I think is going to be completely okay for black. Up in material by 1 pawn, giving white a little bit of an advantage as far as attacking. Black's kind of playing defense, kind of just bringing all his pieces back as white continues to attack, but does have that pawn in material up. Instead, Fabiano decides to go ahead and play just development game, bishop here to d7, so paying somewhat respect to his opponent, knowing that Nakamura, if he has just a little bit of breathing room on the attacking front, he can usually take that and turn it into a big advantage. So he doesn't want to get too involved. He doesn't know what Nakamura is kind of prepared for this opening, so he kind of plays it safe, plays bishop here to d7. Now knight to d4. Always an interesting move. I love these small little bishop here to e3 so that it protects the knight here on d4. The knight's being attacked all over the place by the queen, by the pawn, by the knight here, by the bishop, but none of these can take the knight because this pesky little bishop here on g2 is attacking the queen, and this queen is also protecting the knight, so the queen can't take it right here. So although everything is pretty much attacking this knight, it's going to be safe right now because the queen has to move. So the queen's going to come up here to d6, and now the knight's going to move. It has to move. It's being attacked by so many pieces, especially this pawn right here. So then the bishop's going to take here on c6. eyeing down this bishop, and we do see an exchange here on c6. So both sides not trying to get too crazy, pretty much getting material off the board right here, getting into the middle game, approaching the end game, and for all we can tell, it's pretty much equal right now. No one really has an advantage. Both sides have the dark square bishop, both sides queen, double rook, almost the same pawn structure as well. So for the most part, it's deadlock right now. Now, if we look at this board state, we can start to think about what white options has. He could always get his queen involved into the game. Doesn't want to get too involved to a4 since it'd be attacked, but maybe queen here to b3. This does protect this pawn here on b2. That's one option. Could always, if he wanted to, be a little bit more aggressive with his bishop right here, but right now can't do too much. Might as well just attack this pawn here on c5. His other option that he has is to start to activate his rooks. Rooks are always going to do well on open files if there's no pawns, or also a semi-open file, meaning that your own pawn is not on that file, but your opponent's is, and so it allows you to really aim down, put a lot of pressure on your opponent, and that's what Nakamura does. Brings his rook over here to c1, activating it on the semi-open file, attacking his pawn here on c5. Black it's kind of a nuisance just to have to worry about this rook right here. Now, if we kind of look at black on the d file has its own semi-open file, so eventually he will get one of his rooks here on d8 so he can counterattack here on the semi-open d file. Now from here, the queen's going to come over here to a6, attacking this pawn. It would be a mistake if the bishop came down here and attacked on b2, because then we could just have the rook up here to c5, forcing this queen to move after the queen moves. Then all of a sudden, pawn to d4. This bishop right here is trapped, and it's just very, very frustrating for black. Now, black could look at it and say, okay, but this pawn here is now free, so I'll just come down here, get my queen involved, I'll take here on a2, but then just very, very tough for black. All of a sudden, queen here to a2, or to d2, this bishop can't move because then the queen's going to fall. The queen has to stay somewhat close, or the bishop's going to fall. Say the queen comes here to a3, still trying to hold on to it as well. Rook down here to c2, attacking the bishop. The bishop could move. Now the rook gets involved, attacking this pawn up here on b7, just threatening so many squares. Rook up here to a6, trying to hold on to both the bishop now and the pawn, but he's somewhat overloaded. All of a sudden, rook here to c1. We could have bishop or pawn here to b5. Rook over here to a2, and you're going to see material fall for black. So this is going to be bad. Sometimes people always say, you know, hey, what about that move 14? Couldn't have the queen just taken on a2? So I thought I would, on certain situations, kind of go through some of the lines to show, actually no, if the bishop takes here on b2, that's going to be extremely bad. But black decides to go ahead and play queen here to a6, attacking this pawn here on a2, and now the queen's going to come up here to b3, activating a little bit, needs to get involved into the action, and also protecting this pawn here on a2. Now black plays pawn to b6, just solidifying this pawn chain. And let's again look at what white can do. He already has this semi-open file kind of controlled by his rook. He could activate this a little more. Could always bring it here to c2, to c4. Doesn't want to bring it to c3 since it would be killed by the bishop, but c4 seems reasonable. That'd be a somewhat aggressive play. Could always move around his queen, but he just got here to b3, protecting this pawn, so probably not going to be doing too much with that. Could always bring his rook over here to d1. This is a move that I like. Activating your rooks in the middle of the board and then pushing pawns forward is always a game plan that usually works out pretty well. In this particular case, we see Nakamura play rook here to c4, getting ready to be pretty aggressive. Now the other rook can swing behind it on the semi-open file. Your rooks connected are always going to be a good thing. Now rook over here to d8, as we said before, Fabiano needs to kind of counterattack, and getting your rook involved to the other semi-open file that black has is going to be a good idea. Rook over here to c1, as we mentioned. Rook here to d7, getting ready to do the same thing, double barrel with the rook here on d8. So both game plans right now, we can kind of look at it and for the most part guess what they're going to do. There's not too many creative moves. There's no knights on boards we have to worry about anything too crazy. Both sides have the same bishop pair, but they're really kind of blocked off. They can't really do anything too much. All the opponents have to do is keep their rooks on the opposite colors, and they don't have to worry about too much. The queens are kind of blocked off right now on the queen side of the board, so they're not going to be doing too much. So for the most part right now, we're going to see pretty straightforward moves. Getting into the end game, potentially see some exchanges or some crazy sacrifices, and potentially go into the end game in a somewhat draw state if we get into kind of a rook and bishop or a rook end game. We'll just see how it goes. So rook over here to d8, kind of double barreling on the d file. Rook over here to f4, attacking this pawn here on f7, also opening up the door for the other rook to come here to c4 if Nakamura wants to. Bishop here to f6, kind of blocking this off. Pawn to h4. And this is kind of the first, hey, we're pushing forward from Nakamura. He really, from the very beginning, after that pawn here to c4 in the English opening, he's stayed pretty passive with his pawns, which is completely fine. This is kind of the first point where he says, okay, we're going to start pushing forward. We're going to start pushing forward on the king side, and let's see what happens. Fabiano plays queen to b7. Now, rook here to c2, queen up here to b8, rook down here to f3, just kind of moving pieces, solidifying their structure a little bit more, not doing anything too crazy. Rook down here to d5, just more of a centralizing square right here. Bishop here to g5, and then queen to d6. I think black is maybe better served taking the bishop right here in the actual game after queen to d6. We see the bishop take. The queen can't recapture because of the rook here, and so black has double pawns on the f-file. Usually not something you want to have going into the endgame. It's not nearly as bad on the c-file, d, e, or f-file if you have double pawns. Much worse if you have it on, say h or the a-file. So it's not the worst, but if we kind of look at that compared to if the bishop takes here on g5, and then maybe kind of an in-between move, pawn here to e4, threatening this rook if the bishop takes first and then we recapture, this rook's going to move. This is going to be completely fine for black. Has kind of an opening right here that he can get to later, but all in all, I don't see a lot of goodness that white gets out of this. I think this is fine for black. In the game, though, Fabiano decided to go ahead and give himself the double pawns and wanted to kind of keep open both of these central squares, the d-file and the e-file, for his rooks and his queens if he wants to. So queen over here to a4. Pawn down to a5, kind of stopping that attack. Queen over here to f4. Opening up the door for an exchange if Fabiano wants it. Fabiano does not want it right away. First plays pawn here to f5, and then we do see an exchange off the board. So this is a rook endgame. Things are pretty drawish here. Two of the top players in the world. It's tough to expect much except getting to kind of a drawish endgame here. But rooks at the endgame, especially with a ton of pawns on board, it's very difficult for anyone to get an advantage. Usually the only way someone's going to win is if they can get their rooks behind enemy lines. So if you can get your rook back here on like the 7th rank, you can kind of chase the king around, tie up your opponent's rook to protecting pawns instead of being behind and supporting their own pawns pushing forward. That's really going to be the only way, but with so many pawns, it does look like this is headed for a drawish endgame for sure. Rook up here to f4. Rook to d4. We do see an exchange on board, so making it a little bit easier to navigate around instead of not having to worry about two rooks, now just one rook. Both sides are going to activate their kings. Kings, as we've talked about in mini games, once your opponent has their major pieces off the board, especially their queen and one of their rooks for sure, you can always centralize your king, not in too much trouble. These pawns aren't really going to be putting too much pressure on the king, so use your king as a powerful piece to attack your opponent, kind of push those rooks away from those central squares. King is definitely a huge piece in the game. King here to f6, pawn here to e3, forcing the rook back. King to f3, king to e5, kind of more of the centralized for Fabiano. He's kind of beaten Nakamura to the punch as far as the middle of the board, but both sides again are going to have a tough time really doing anything as far as breaking through. Pawn a5 or a4, king here to d5, king back here to e2. See a few more moves as we kind of come back here. King here to c3, just navigating a little bit. Pawn to b5, pretty interesting move from Fabiano to go ahead and offer in exchange right here. King here to b5. This does open up the door a little bit. It is going to be somewhat difficult for Nakamura to take advantage on the king side to get his rook over here. But Fabiano looks like, even though he only has 2 pawns, that he's going to try to be somewhat aggressive. He could play rook to a7. That's going to be very good and start to put a lot of pressure over here, pushing his pawn forward. Can always get his king involved as well. And then if there is an exchange, he can just come down, take with his rook, and then get behind enemy lines. So that's what Fabiano is looking for. We first see pawn here to b3, and then a pretty interesting move. So we're in move 40, and Fabiano is getting short on time, and he plays pawn here to g5. And what's interesting is there's these small little moves, especially in an endgame, where it's a very small minor mistake, but it actually has huge consequences. And what happens is, after pawn here to g5, because he has a lot of different options. We already talked about rook here to a7. That makes a lot of sense, supporting this pawn, pushing forward. That to me is going to be my go-to. You can always play pawn here to h5, just kind of clog up the board. There's no reason. Fabiano probably has a little bit more of an initiative. He has more of a centralized king. He does have, in my opinion, a more active rook if he wants to. But pawn here to g5 kind of flips the script. After pawn takes here on g5 and pawn recaptures on g5, then rook here to h1 is very, very dangerous. All of a sudden, there's no real way for black to stop this rook coming up here and getting involved into the action. Now, in the actual game, the rook's going to come over here to a7, a little bit too late, and then rook up here to h7. This is exactly where Nakamura wants to be, in behind enemy lines, attacking this pawn. Now all of a sudden this pawn can't move. This rook is kind of tied to it, which he really wants to be tied to this pawn here on a5. But even if we come back, let's say the pawn's going to come here to f6 instead. So, you know, the rook can't come here to h7, but what it can do is just come back here to h8, and then maybe rook here to b7, because the rook was threatening here to b8. But now all of a sudden, rook here to f8, attacking this pawn. Now, depending on where black goes, white's just going to be a nuisance back here. You can kind of just move his rook back and forth, and all in all, it's going to be a easy game for Nakamura to kind of control this, since he has now the aggressive piece. So if we come back here, after the rook comes over here to a7, rook up here to h7, we do start to see a few exchange off the board, and then pawn pushing up forward to e4. This is another reason why Nakamura is pleased that there's no pawns in the center of the board, and he now has both his d pawn and the e pawn, and he is pushing those bad boys as fast as possible. Pawn up here to a4, we do see exchange off the board. So Fabiano does get a little bit of counterplay. He has a rook on the queen side, but Nakamura just has too strong of an attack. Rook here to f7, threatening this pawn. This rook is going to chase the king around, but all it's really doing is allowing Nakamura to get his king in a better spot. So king to f3 is a really good spot. Rook over here to d2, but then all of a sudden rook to d7 is a great central square for the rook, also protecting this pawn right here. King c6, rook here to a d5, a nice outpost with this pawn right here. Always fun to see outpost on your rook late into the end game. It just doesn't happen very often, so it's a treat to actually see it in a high-level game. King here to b6, pushing forward. Now once the king comes back, we're going to see the rook come back here to d6, and Nakamura can just continue to do the same thing. Keep his rook here on the d file, protecting this pawn, and then just continue to push up with the e file pawn. This king can never get past the chasm of the d file because of the rook here. All in all, it's going to be a lost game. The king can come up here to f4 at any time if he wants to, you know, assuming he doesn't want this rook to come over here to f2. But so many threats that Nakamura has, Fabiano is forced to resign in this situation, just way too far behind, recognizing that there's no real way to stop this pawn from pushing forward. So Nakamura, as always, he's on a tear. Everyone that comes in his way, he is just destroying on the chessboard. It's exciting to watch. So really enjoy this. He's in first place right now, tied with 2.5 points after 3 matches. So congratulations to him on another well-fought victory. Hopefully you guys are enjoying this. Really interesting match. I thought 2 of the top players playing a somewhat different opening, somewhat the same since English symmetrical, but then getting into the endgame with a very, very small minor mistake that all of a sudden turns into a pretty easy endgame for one of the top players in the world. So everyone, thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in coverage of round 4 tomorrow.